So I think I'm going to start. Uh, so just before I start, I'm just going to focus, this talk is not going to focus on any technical aspects of making the art of the witness. I'm going to try to show you the journey that we went through to figure out the art style and why we ended up doing certain decisions. So a bit about myself. My name is Luis Antonio. I was born in Lisbon, Portugal, and I've been working in the industry for over 9 years as a 3D artist. I started at Rockstar Games in London as an environment and character artist. I worked on games like Manhunt 2, Midnight Club LA, on Max Payne before I left. And then I moved to Quebec City, and I joined Ubisoft as a lead artist and eventually art director. I worked on games like Dance on Broadway, Power Up Heroes, I'm sure you never heard about them, and other titles that are not really worth mentioning. Tired of these creative constraints of commercial titles, I tried to turn to indie development. Thanks to Chris Hecker, I ended up in contact with Jonathan Blow, and I joined his team here in San Francisco to work on The Witness. We're a small independent studio called Thekla Inc., led by Jonathan Blow. He's the driving force behind the whole project and can be seen as the creative director, producer, or designer. He designs the game and implements it. Currently, the studio is composed of 3 programmers, 4 artists, and other collaborators that come in and out as we need. There are no titles or leads. Everyone is responsible for their own work and their own schedule. It's a very organic and empowering environment which helps to develop great artwork. Also, for this project, we collaborated with architects and landscape architect studios. This will make sense later in the presentation. And I want to say thank you to the team that helped me prepare this talk. I hope you guys enjoyed. So this is the trailer that we made for the PlayStation 4 announcement of the game, for those who don't know about it. There's some audio. I hope it's on. So what is The Witness? It's a first-person puzzle adventure game in an uninhabited island. The island is divided into areas, and each one has its own theme, kind of like Disneyland, in a good way. Each area has a set of puzzles that unlocks a laser that allows you to access the final area and complete the game. The player is free to explore any part of the island at any time, and apart from audio recordings that are scattered throughout the island, nothing is explained to the player. So it's up to the player to find meaning through exploration and experimentation. There is no soundtrack, only environmental audio. So Jonathan had clear goals for what the art style should be, and I'm going to try to cover them here. So what he wanted was to minimize the amount of noise we put into the player's mind. Since the visuals are the primary channel of how information gets into your mind from the game, we have to be very careful that the things that grab your attention are the things that are most meaningful. Otherwise, it will be very mentally noisy. The art has to support and extend the gameplay principles. So we need to use the art to guide the player and teach him the rules of the world. Like, can I walk here? Is this object relevant to gameplay? It has to be easy for the player to navigate and orient himself all the time. And finally, the island has to be based in the real world. It has to be grounded in real-world rules for gameplay purposes. It has to have realistic lighting, shadows, audio, and physics. And it has to be a logical reasoning for how and why the island is laid out. Like, why is this building here? What was its function? So this was the state of the game before we started to focus on the art style. Similarly to Braid, the art team was brought in when the core of the game was complete and about 90% of the puzzles were done. You could sit down and play the game from start to a rough ending. There was a rough layout of the island and the themes of each area were clearly defined. You could experience what the game was about and understand the concepts and ideas behind it. So looking at the island with this level of completion allowed us to understand what to look for and start the process of finding the art style. We broke this down in a couple of steps. So the first one was research and inspirations. How did other art forms approach this attempt at simplifying reality? Movies, paintings, photography, commercials, video games. And how did they solve these challenges? The other one is inspiration. What did we like in our research? What do we feel that it worked? And what connects with the art team and inspires us? Then we'll define our art guidelines and key challenges. What did we learn from the research? And how can we use these principles in the witness, on the witness? And then we implement and iterate. We apply the principles to the island. We iterate until we're satisfied with the results. We try not to think about technical constraints. And we try not to forget the original goal, since things will get diluted through iteration. So for our research, we decided to learn how other artists managed to simplify reality and ask ourselves some questions. Like, how much texture do you need to define a material? You can define a shape using only the outlines. In this example, the rooftop, the chimney, the windows, and it's enough to convey the idea of a house. Do you need any other detail? And how much information can you get with shapes? Can we get rid of texture completely? And what about using the noise to create contrast between different elements? In this example, organic versus man-made. We also look at other mediums and how they approach this simplification and the ones that were successful, which raise the question, are we going for something realistic or stylized, and what does that mean? So a game like Mirror's Edge, in this example, stays on the realistic side. The amount of detail on objects, as well as the texture noise, matches reality, but the use of color and saturation is exaggerated and used very well to convey key gameplay elements. There is also a cleanliness to the environments. There's no dirt or grime, and creates a very appealing, attractive final result. In a way, they successfully simplified and distorted reality for their gameplay purposes. Other games like Journey or Team Fortress allowed us to see how simple you can go with very little texture and geometry. Since the geometry and texture are so simplified, there is a bigger responsibility in how you use them to convey information. Color becomes more relevant in showing the importance between different elements, and there is a stronger element of stylization. So this is an example of a TV commercial, and you can see they stylized the environment a lot in order to make it more captivating and dynamic. And this is something we liked. But it made us wonder, is this something we should do, and why should we do it? Does the gameplay benefit from this stylization? So we know that the player knowledge of the real world, how light and shadow works, is very important. So this means if we're going to distort reality, we need to have a good reason to do so. And raises the question, how can we be expressive if we're simplifying reality, but we don't want to stylize it? So by looking at landscape painters, we realize they're doing this all the time. In plein air painting, artists are always looking for ways to cheat in the way they represent reality while keeping it realistic. They won't paint every single leaf in a tree, but when you look at it, the idea is there. They're also extremely good at understanding what to simplify. And I feel that is one of the things that took us longer to understand. So this made us realize that we can be expressive and stylize reality if we use it to emphasize the properties of what we're representing. We don't need to show every single branch on a tree. But if you convey the proportions and thickness of the trunk and its shape, you will understand what it is. We don't need to model every single leaf, but to show its properties. Are they fluffy, thin? Is it a young tree or an old one? And this leads to another area, the collaboration with the landscape and architect studios, designing the island structures. So when I joined, I found this pretty weird. Like, why don't we get concept artists? How much can these guys bring to the project? And they don't have any video game development background. Well, I couldn't be more wrong. So this is how the island looked when they joined. There were basic ideas for a mountain, a desert, there's a castle, a windmill on the background. Apart from that, everything was open to change. And this is where their knowledge made a difference. Architects and landscape architects, they deal with the real world. They're limited by the physicality of the place they have to work on, budget constraints, client's objectives, and the purpose of the structure. We didn't have any of these limitations, so they had to create them. They tried to understand, if this island was to exist in the real world, how would it come to be? Would the mountain probably originate from a volcano? What is the wet and the dry side? What are the different biomes? And what is the relationship between them? Throughout this process, they also defined the narrative for the civilizations that occupy the island. What were their philosophies and religions? And how do those affect their building methodologies? And how do these people adapt to the environment they live in? They created a rich relationship between nature and architecture. They were able to design time through the island, providing a conceptual history for the whole project. So this is a localized example where you can see the relationship between the environment and the architecture and how they influence each other. On the Civilization 1 image, you can see early civilization quarry mining, and there was just manual stone cutting. Then on Civilization 2, they used more advanced manual tools. They used stone to build churches, temples, and other structures. And on the final image, it's an industrial scale production. They use stones to create concrete, and they use that concrete to create factories, like the one on the image, and other more modern structures. And this is how it looks in the game. So this is a tower in the game and how it looked at the start. With this rich narrative, it allowed us to find answers to our questions. What are the materials to build a structure? Where do we get them? How do we carry these materials? And what is the function of the building? The architects now had the answers to these questions. And using them alongside Jonathan's gameplay limitations, the relationship of the buildings with the landscape, and the availability of the island raw materials, they could figure out how the buildings would look. Also, this grounding and logic finally allowed us to define the art style. Now we knew what features we wanted to keep, what we wanted to simplify, and if we're stylizing, why we should do so. So these are the guidelines that we came up with. The first one was it would be a simplified reality. It's not a cartoon style, but a simplified representation of reality. We convey only the core characteristics of what is being displayed, and we remove everything else that is not relevant. It has to be pleasant and harmonious. So there has to be a constant and clear navigation, orientation, and landmarks, distinct areas and color fields, and a clear relationship between elements and the hierarchy, like the paths, the panels, and the environment background. And the art has to be an extension of the gameplay and the core game design. The art cannot contradict what the gameplay is trying to achieve. The art has to support and extend the gameplay, and ideally, the art will be part of the gameplay. So with these guidelines in mind, we started to apply them to the most important elements on the island, the man-made structures, rock formations, and the vegetation. So starting with buildings, we tried to look at how could we reduce reality. So we picked up a photo of an old castle, and we tried to see what will we accentuate and what are we going to reduce. So the tower from before, this is the first implementation after we got the design from the architects. So we took a screenshot and we tried to analyze the results. The sky felt too noisy and distracted from the building shape. There was unnecessary brick, noise, and grime. It didn't bring any extra information. The geometry is not working with the texture detail. You can see on that broken corner on the side there. And the light is accentuating how flat the geometry is. You can see that at our edge is extremely sharp. So we took the same screenshot. We painted the texture map. We tried to think like, how can we convey a brick wall? So we minimized the amount of colors to show that it's a brick wall by just showing the rectangles that form the bricks. We took out the clouds to let the silhouette read. And we tried to add details where it matters to convey the properties of stone. In the corners, in the broken wall, and the brick highlights on the silhouette. We took a similar approach for the rock formations. We looked at reality and we tried to understand what are the key elements that define these shapes. We started with the photo reference and we used some filters to remove noise, and we started to understand these elements. Then we tried to apply them to a sculpture and see how that would read. So we were happy with the results. So we built a test scene with these rocks and see how it feels to walk in this environment. Seeing things in context makes a big difference rather than isolated test. We were happy with the results. There was still enough detail to understand the material, and it was simplified enough not to be distracting. Here are some more examples. There are some basalt rocks. This is a rocky desert cliffside. And this is the quarry that I showed previously. So the final element was vegetation. This was a different challenge. Unlike the buildings, reducing the noise of foliage was not that straightforward. The landscape artists gave us plenty of reference, but our initial attempts never felt right. Everything would come out too noisy or too realistic. The vegetation would feel flat and boring. And anytime we mix different types of foliage, it would come out a mess, like you can see on the bottom left example. It's very noisy and boring. So we took a step back and we tried to understand the nature of vegetation. We looked back at our references and tried to see what we liked. These are some classical anime backgrounds, and they all have a realism and simplicity at the same time. The foreground vegetation is very detailed, but the background blends really nicely. It has volume and shape without getting lost in detail. So this made us wonder, what if we tried to represent a type or a certain feeling rather than a specific kind of bush or tree? And what if we apply these principles of the painted backdrops to our art style? So, awesome work from the programmers, some technical tricks on the art side, and we achieved what we were looking for. We simplified the trunks and silhouette to get the core properties of the tree, and we created the impression of leaves without drawing them individually. Also, we didn't just find these results. We had tons of failed attempts, but each one got us closer to our ideal final result. And I think having a clear goal in mind, rather than accepting the results that we got from our technical knowledge, allowed us to achieve a look that hopefully will make this game feel unique. Here's another area, how it looked before and after. So, as we apply this stylization, the importance of landscape reference becomes really big. This is an image of a natural layering on a tropical rainforest. Since we're only representing the essential detail, it means that if you make the wrong choices, things will very quickly look plastic and artificial. And landscape gave us valuable understanding of the relationship between the different elements and made sure we understood the references we were using. And this is an example that I like to show. So on this, the palm trees on this image. In our first version, we didn't have any dry hanging leaves because we didn't know, in the wild there is no one to cut them. And we forgot about that. And it adds a lot to it. So with all these elements, we could now apply them to the game design. This is an area very early in the game when the player has freedom of movement for the first time. So our goal here was to guide to the player as much as possible. So we made the path brighter in order to make it clear where to go without getting lost, even though you can leave it at any time. We got the bushes to fade into the background. And if you look closely, you can see a red bush further ahead that unconsciously will drive the player towards that location. Another important thing with the landmarks. This is a view from the highest point on the mountain. In the original version, besides being lower, the landmarks were not that distinct. The building shapes would help, but the landscape was very bland. So using our art guidelines, We made sure that each area has its own distinct vibe and color palette, and we use stronger shapes to help create memorable landmarks. Finally, another part of our iteration process would be to revisit areas that we considered very close to finish after some time had passed. We could look at it with fresh eyes and understand what needed to be improved. So this is an example where the most important thing is the gate and the panel. They have to stand out since they're the most important elements. But the trees on the back and the vegetation are calling attention to themselves. So with a quick paint over, we were able to test some of the ideas and see how we could improve the results. We changed the brightness of the different elements so the important structures pop out more. We also changed the panel color so it stands out more to the player. This is another more subtle example. So here the walls and the pillars, we already went through our art style. And even though they're simplified, they felt very noisy. That white box is like temporary art. Don't pay attention to it. So we realized, I'm going to show you, we could remove all the noise from the pillar's flat surface and use only the silhouette to represent the stone properties. I'm going to show you the old image. The room still read the same, but with a much cleaner result. So these are the conclusions we arrived at. Don't think about technical limitations. Always think about what you want to achieve, then find out how to achieve it. You might end up having to cut down on your vision, but you do it as late as possible so it stays as good as it possibly can. Always be aware of the big picture. So several times we got lost in our goals. Something would look amazing and we wanted to keep it even if it didn't bring anything to the table. Or we would just get lost in very small details. Having someone that carries a strong vision makes all the difference. And finally, have a reason for everything you do, or most of it. So artists often don't think about what they're doing, or they don't ask why they're doing it. They decide on a certain direction, and they make decisions without looking back to see if they're justified. So just like in painting, where every single brushstroke counts, every single rock, plant, or polygon that we place needs to have a reason to exist. And that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.